Servus and hello, Matthias Eichler here, and this is Singletrack. This week, I'm chatting with Nicole Amyx, filmmaker, ultra runner, and colleague of mine at the Trail Running Film Festival. Well, speaking of the Trail Running Film Festival, as the 2023 global tour is slowly winding down, I, on behalf of everyone on my team, wanted to say huge thank you to everyone who bought a ticket to watch the films in person or virtually. All our incredible filmmakers who submitted films for us to take on this crazy tour. To our fantastic hosts in over 70 locations all over the world. And to our wonderful sponsors who believed in us and supported the tour and our team. It's been an incredible run, and yes, we are already working on 2024. The Trail Running Film Festival will be back, and we are stoked. Stay tuned for info in that, and let's dive into the conversation with Nicole. Nicole, you're on Singletrack. This is super exciting to have you here. I'm already recording, so let's jump right in. So we have met. Welcome to the show. Let's start there.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on.
So we have met through the film festival sometime last year or something like that. You have been involved with the Trail Running Film Festival much longer than I am, and we're going to talk about this. But now you're on Singletrack, which means no video, even though we're seeing each other. We're recording on Zoom. Yeah, exactly. We don't have to worry about trying to lay this beautiful track to some awesome atmospheric music or something. No, this is just a podcast. So let's chat very briefly. Nicole, you are down in San Francisco. Give us a little bit about where you're sitting right now.
So I am in Marin County, so north of the Golden Gate Bridge in Northern California. I was born and raised here in Mill Valley. Right now I am in Novato, which is in between San Francisco and Sonoma County. It's beautiful. We're in a little bit of a heat wave. I'm in my office and it's getting pretty stuffy.
That's usually the podcaster's dilemma, that in the summertime it gets really stuffy. So my Marin County, I've never been in Marin County. My only connection to it is that the first time I was in San Francisco, I was very early in my running career. The iPhone had just not come out. It came into my hands, and I was at a conference, some tech seminar, whatever, down there. And I was like, okay, I am gonna try to run the Golden Gate Bridge. So I woke up at 5 a.m, stumbled out of the hotel. I had no idea how I would even get to the Golden Gate Bridge. There was a cab up front. I asked the guy to drive me to the Golden Gate Bridge. He drove me to that park that is right up there. Dropped me off there. It was like 5 a.m. It was dark. The bridge was like all foggy the way it so often is, right? And so I ran over the bridge, and I have some of the most amazing photos from that morning, because the way the light played with the fog, and you could barely see
the fog
and stuff. And so I ran across, saw the Marin County sign, and ran back, and then used my phone to navigate to find my way back to the hotel. That was like one of the most epic runs that I've ever done in my life. So I've ran the Golden Gate Bridge sometime early in the morning. Have you run?
That's pretty amazing.
Have you run the bridge before?
I have run the bridge. I do run it occasionally. I don't love running on the bridge. I probably take for granted how often I cross the Golden Gate Bridge. I cross it multiple times a week, but I don't actually like running the bridge that much, because it's like 2 miles long. So it feels actually really long, and it's a slight incline the first half and then a slight decline the second half. And there's like cars going by, and it's such a stunning view. But most of the time I'm just wanting to get to the other side.
I mean, it is as iconic as the bridge it is, and as glorious as the views are. It is sort of a crazy, trippy experience with the cars rushing by, right? And I remember being early in the morning and all these signs telling people not to jump and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Stuff, right? I mean, it does put you into kind of a weird headspace a little bit.
Yeah.
So, you're a trail runner, but you're also a filmmaker. Let's quickly talk about your film side because it's super fun since we're connected on Instagram. You're like posting pictures from Skywalker Ranch, which is equally trippy. So tell me a little bit. So how did you get into filmmaking and kind of where you at currently?
So it's kind of interesting. My background, my dad is a filmmaker and my mom is an ultra runner. So I somehow came out as some exact blend of my parents. So my dad has been involved in filmmaking since I was born. First, he was working in LA in motion pictures. He moved up to Northern California and started his own small business. So for as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a filmmaker. I don't know if you like did this when you were really young, but you like, write what you want to be when you grow up. And I wrote a letter to myself. I was 10 years old and I wrote a letter to my future self, future Nicole, like what I want to be doing. And I wrote, I wanted to make movies like Walt Disney, because at that time I was very into Walt Disney.
Sure. Yeah.
So I always knew I wanted to be a filmmaker. So fast forward, I went to film school in San Francisco. I got my master's in the UK. And kind of ever since then, I've just been trying to build up my career kind of on two sides. One side of my career is wanting to make my own films about my own passion projects, mostly, like running and female and sports driven films. But at the same time, I also want to be involved on bigger projects, specifically documentaries, like those cool documentaries that you see on Netflix or on Hulu. So that side of my career is more going up the ladder. Right now, I'm working as an assistant editor in post-production. I hope to eventually be a feature documentary editor. So yeah, I'm constantly working, doing stuff for myself and my passion, but also building up my name in the industry, which is really hectic.
It is an interesting industry, and I know nothing about it, but the reality is that it's an incredibly creative field, yet at the same time, the industry, the final product is so big always that you cannot really produce something good just completely by yourself, right? I mean, you need, like, you can very easily see when something has a proper budget, when something has a proper team behind it. And so as a creative person, that's an interesting challenge and juxtaposition, because you'll always rely on sort of the business side, the funding, and the team around you. Like, you can't really be the solopreneur, right? It's tough to be just the single person as a creative.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because they always say, like, you hear all these successful filmmakers, and they always say, to be successful, just grab a camera and shoot. Just go out and shoot. Just go out and shoot. And I mean, I do that. I've been shooting with my camera, and I do that all the time. But that doesn't like translate to being successful in the film industry, because the industry is so much more complex. And so when I'm working on a project that I'm like all the way down the ladder, and the editor and the director and the producer and the budget. And then even after that, we have to say, if I'm working for Netflix, after we do that, Netflix has to approve of this and that. And it's like so much more businessy than you realize. So it's like trying to wrap your head around how are we creative in an industry that's actually very business like driven.
Yeah.
So that's like where my head really like kind of splits when I'm doing multiple projects. It's like, is this a business project? Is this creative? Can I do a little bit of both? How do I get money for this? You're always chasing money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
It is. Oh, I think that's where you are very much a artist and creative again, right? I think every artist and creative, it always has a hard time chasing money and trying to figure out how to fund their sort of passion project. If you would be, if you'd have a wand, you're going back to Disney, and you could say, I would just want to be a creative in a perfect scenario, what would be the most fulfilling for you if you could just be one piece in this puzzle of hundreds of people that make a great film, what would be your perfect role? Where would you see yourself? Where would you find yourself the most creatively fulfilled?
I would say right now I would be most creatively fulfilled in as an editor, which is kind of the path I've been following. Also as a director, obviously a director has so much prestige being the director, and you have those dreams of getting an Oscar as a director, and obviously I still have those daydreams, and it's always going to be a part of me. But when it actually comes to filmmaking, I feel most like it at home, most myself when you're editing, which is, especially in the documentary and the nonfiction world, you're given all this footage and stories and characters, and it's really where you get to craft the story and move pieces around. And let's try this interview here, and then let's bring in music. How does the music become a part of the story? And so I find that by far the most interesting part of the filmmaking process in the nonfiction space, because it's really where you can try so many things and craft the story. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of my
Mm-hmm.
my space.
I like this. I'm a web designer, been designing websites for decades now, and I sometimes love to sort of shut myself off and just code a website and just and that doesn't even have to be then a website for myself, right? I enjoy taking on a project for a client and just kind of disappearing and saying, I'm just going to code this. And I enjoy the process of sort of putting these pieces together. And so I can see a parallel there. I've never been able to, my brain doesn't work in these 4 dimensions of filmmaking. Like I enjoy the 2 dimensions of a website. I can sort of lay out a website and get the messaging across. When I try it with a timeline and times and music on top of it, I mean, that my brain has never worked that way. I'm in awe for people who can craft a narrative around it, because it hurts me so much. I've opened Final Cut Pro and my brain just like
Yeah.
melts. And you know how it is. I mean, it's like, sure, you've used the tools for decades. If I've used those tools, they're comfortable to me. I know what is possible to do, right? I mean, I would love to watch you use these tools that I'm sort of familiar with. I've seen and see what is actually possible. Keyboard shortcuts is how fast you can actually put pieces together, because I think that's the hard part, right? When you're slow, when you don't really know the tools and you have an idea, and when it takes too long to put that idea into practice, then you can't really try 20 different versions, because it takes too long to recompile even your brain, right? And in order to let your creativity flow, you need to be able to be fast and just move things along quickly.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting kind of like divide between your brain working creatively while your technical side also has to be activated. So it's like you're thinking and the story and this, but at the same time you have to think about the tech and the keyboard shortcuts, like you said. So it's always like kind of like a dance between the two. And people always like say, when I was learning to like edit, they're like, it's all about the keyboard shortcuts and you have to edit fast and you have to edit fast. And I was like, it's fine, I don't need to be like that fast. And then now that I've learned keyboard shortcuts and I'm much more advanced, I'm like, oh yeah, it makes a huge difference.
And that's when creativity, and I think that is not just modern computer creativity, right? I mean, you watch Bob Ross paint happy trees and you think that it's easy, but trying to put a paintbrush on a
Right.
canvas, and you realize, oh, there's so much technique to it. There's so much the equivalent of keyboard shortcuts to it that allows you then to be creative on top of it, right? Which is very important, where an artist can really be, they need to have their fundamentals down in some respect,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I'm in an interesting point, because as an assistant editor, our main job is to do all the tech to make it easy for an editor. So the editor really gets to use all of their creative juices, because everything's been set up for them. All the technical troubleshooting and issues have been set up for the assistant editor. So right now, on big projects, because I work mostly as an assistant editor, my technical skills are I like know how to set it up in XYZ,
Mhm.
but because I'm not using my creative brain as much because the editor does that more, it's like, okay, I need to activate my creative brain as well so I don't forget that whole side of my brain.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
so you mentioned Oscars and you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
documentaries. Documentaries are only, when it comes to the business side, only a very, very small part of the overall movie making
Mm-hmm.
industry, right? Fiction is so much more sellable, if you will.
Lucrative, yeah.
What is it that fascinates you about documentaries?
Well, when I wanted to like follow in my dad's footsteps and become a filmmaker, I always had the intention of going to Hollywood and making, you know, fiction motion picture films. That was what I thought I wanted to do. And it wasn't really until I got to college and I actually started practicing in documentary that I realized I found it so much more interesting from the production standpoint because um obviously there's everybody knows it's like I am quoting real stories because you still manipulate them even in
Mm,
documentaries, but there's so much more, I would say, like excitement because you can follow things that are happening in real time in the world, and there's going to be a million stories. For example, right now I'm working on documentaries that have to do with like the planet and sustainability and the environment, and that's such a huge topic, but within that topic there's hundreds of stories that you could follow. So it almost feels like there's like an endless amount of stories happening in the real world that are worth you know
mhm.
translating onto the big screen for people to see. And I know they're not, documentaries kind of considered a B below, the Hollywood movies. And I love Hollywood movies, but I just find it a more fulfilling and just interesting path to take as a filmmaker. I feel like as a documentary filmmaker, you get to become a researcher, a student, an educator. You get to take on all these roles, a journalist. Like there's so many different roles you get to take within the documentary sphere.
I mean, you speaking my language. If I feel like if I would be 100% in control of the remote at home, I think I would almost only watch documentaries. I mean, sure, I can get into the latest whatever Succession on HBO or something like that, right? It's good escapism, and I appreciate it for that, what it is. But I think I enjoy real stories more because even though sometimes they're more uncomfortable or more challenging, they are in some respects more inspiring because it's actually real people. It's not made up stuff that doesn't actually connect in any way to who we are, right? I mean, yeah, if we watch a superhero, that's not inspiring. It's not real,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
entertaining, it's escapism, but it doesn't connect to who we are. So, documentary filmmaking, you're working on your own projects. Um, and now let's bring in the trail running, or let's perhaps hold off on the trail running. Are your personal projects all in the outdoor running world, or do you go broader?
Um, I would say I would go broader. I would have to say that since my most recent like master short documentary came out a couple years ago, I kind of put almost a pause button on making so many of my own films because there's only so much time in the day, and I it's obviously insane, and so I put a pause on focusing on my own passion projects because I've been trying to build a name for myself within the industry. So I've been trying to grow that skill set, but at the same time my brain's always thinking like what next film do I want to make. And sometimes I get asked to go film, like a running retreat, and I get to like kind of use that part of my brain and stuff like that. So I would say that I'm really in trail running, and women in sports is like my I would say central passion, but I wouldn't say that's the only thing I would do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it's just hard to know. It's almost kind of like writer's block, almost like, because I've been doing so much of other work, I almost feel like I have writer's block in trying to come up with my own films, that I'm like having to like kind of start to think about that again. And working with the Trail Running Film Festival is a huge is an inspirator. That's not the right word. It's inspiring me to
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
make more of my films because
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
so
yeah.
involved in it.
So, how did you get involved with the Trail Running Film Festival?
So I got involved with them. So my film screened at the Trail Running Film Festival, I think in either 2020 or 2021. It was during still the pandemic, so it was virtual. So my film screened there, and it was great.
Tell
And
people the title of your film.
the title of my film is Finding Her Stride.
Okay.
And we can talk about it. And so my film screened there, and then after that, and I was like, wow, great, like a film festival that's about trail running and filmmaking. And I saw a job, not like they were looking for somebody to help with the diversity, equity, and inclusion side, and they were trying to fund films that were more DEI based. And so I came onto the team to kind of be like a DEI advisor. And for people who only hear my voice, I am a mixed race Mexican American female, so I felt like I had a good perspective on that side. So I came in just initially just to consult with the team for this DEI grant, and then from there I just got more and more involved, and I started doing more filmmaking work with the team, and I just felt like it was the perfect fit for me to combine trail running and filmmaking, which are my two greatest passions.
That's amazing. And you were responsible for putting the film reel together for the 2023 tour. We got all the films lined up. We could put everything in order. And I mean, that wasn't the most creative project ever in that sense, but it is still fulfilling because we had to come up with sort of order for the films and sort of connect it all together and take these loose pieces that we had and turn them into a thing, right? I mean, turn them into a film in itself, right? And so that was all going through your hands. So thank you very much. I think it turned out incredible for this year.
It was great.
So let's talk about your film, Finding Your Stride. It is a very personal film. And I mean, perhaps as a creative, that could be a reason for why you have a little bit of writer's block, right? Because if you tell a very personal story, then do you keep telling your story in different facets over and over again? Then that's almost turns you into sort of an Instagram influencer who just navel gazes every moment, right? Or do you wait for some fundamental big change to happen again? Or do you just sit and tell somebody else's story? Tell us about your story. So Finding Your Stride, which surprised me too, because you said it now that you were going to film school in like England. I expected the film to be about California, and then it wasn't at all. Very little.
Yes. So yeah, you hit the nail right on the head there with the my constant debate about continuing to talk about myself or focus on other people. So in the sense that I spent so many years making a film about myself that I'm like, I want to make a film and focus on other people, but how do I transition? Mm-hmm. So I went to film school in England to get my master's in documentary filmmaking. And for our thesis film, we had to make a documentary, and that was the only thing that they told us, make a documentary. But And so I knew, and I had done in my undergrad, I had done another piece on ultra running and people recovering addicts who turned to ultra running. So I'd done some pieces, and I knew that I wanted to kind of follow that path, especially living with my mom, who is such a successful ultra runner. And my teachers really told me, they said, that's a great idea. Ultra running is very interesting, but we don't want just like a film that describes ultra running, that like a YouTube film, like this is
Hmm.
what ultra running is. They're like,
Hmm.
that's going to be boring. No one wants to watch a film about people running for 20 minutes. So if you want to do this film, you need a story. You can't just film people running. And so I had no intention of making this film about myself or even my mom. My idea was like, I want to know why women are so successful in ultra running. Ultra running is one of the main spaces where women can compete at a more equal level, get closer times to men. And so that's what I wanted to do. And they were like, but why? Why do you want to do this? And so through that, I started to it was almost like therapy, realize that I had this chip on my shoulder with running because my mom was such a successful runner, and me, even though I was a runner and a cross country runner growing up, was not a successful runner. I'm still very middle of the pack runner, which I love. But at that point, when I was growing up, I had really bad race anxiety. I would show up to cross country races in high school crying. I dropped out of races because the anxiety and the pressure was so much. And it's not like my mom put pressure on me. It's just that I felt the pressure of trying to live up to these expectations of a woman who finished Western States, top 10 women a lot. And so I was like, that's not me. And so all of this came out while I was coming up with this film idea, and my teachers were like, that's your film. Your film is about why women ultra run, but why are you making this film? So they're like, you need to put yourself in this film and your relationship with your mom, which is clearly very complex. So that's the long story of how I made my film. And because I was in the UK, I decided to find successful female ultra runners in the UK and follow their stories. And through that, I discovered that these women were either dealing with, the death of a loved one, illness, and all these really strong reasons of why ultra running was their form of meditation. And so I kind of use that also in my film. So yeah, that's kind of how I made my film. So it was a very, very personal piece. And when I released it, and I worked really hard on it. I left my teachers' offices crying many times because they would just criticize and shit on my ideas. And so by the time I finished the film, I was like, I have this film that I'm so proud of that it was very hard for me to let go of realizing that I'd finished my film.
Mm.
And then I had to send it into festivals, and that was very painful too, because there's also a lot of rejection in that world. So it
I mean,
was,
that's the tough part. There is something so beautiful and natural in telling your personal story, but then sort of removing yourself and having to sell
mm-hmm.
that product that you created that is so much of who you are, right? How do you separate the rejection that you're getting from you as an individual, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it comes natural telling your personal story, but then man, if people don't pick up on the product that you're creating, because in the
Yes.
end it's just a thing, right? It
Yeah.
is not you. It is
Mm-hmm.
not, it has no reflection on who you are. And so that's super tough.
Yeah.
Well, the film got submitted to the film festival and got shown in the film festival. So yeah, it's an amazing story, and we'll make sure we'll link it in the show notes for
Mm-hmm.
people to watch it, because it's still out there. How do you, I mean, I'm so approaching this entire conversation from a creative point of view. How do you know when you're done with a film? Because with a website, you can always like tweak code, right? But you and say, well, let me just change the font size here or there. But a film eventually is done, right?
Yeah.
Is it really done for you? I mean, is it ever done?
That is the never ending question, is how do you know your film's done? I would say no, um, because there's always more you can talk about in your whatever film you're making. There's always more you can explore, and there's always more you can do. With my film, for example, for a while I thought of making it almost like a series of films,
Mhm.
and focusing all these different topics that I touched on in my film. I thought of making them a series of films, and it's still a great idea, but I need money and time to do that. But yeah, it's very hard. I would say you're never really done, especially with a film that you're very passionate about, because you're so passionate about the topic that you want to do more and more and more. And I would just say that it's just almost like experience, um, and just eventually learning how to say, okay, this, I'm done. Um, because there's always things you can tweak. And even now I watch my film and there's so many things I would change. And so I've seen my film so many times that now I watch it, I'm like, does this film just suck? Is it just terrible? Because I've just seen it, and I know it's not a bad film. I think it's a great film. I'm very proud of it, but I've seen it so many times, and there's so many things I would change. And so as a filmmaker, I think it's just like a skill that you just develop over time, of learning when to just say, this is done, I'm proud of this piece as it is, and
Mhm.
just kind of, it's almost like ripping the band-aid off.
It is funny because for you as a continuous creative, you need to let it stand as
Mm-hmm.
a product that reflects the story that you wanted to tell at that time, right? And not iterate on it, and rather pick up the new developments, the new perspectives that you have in and pour them into a new project, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's like, okay, how do I take this momentum and carry it to something else? And it's really interesting. When I was making my film, and even now, I draw a lot of comparisons to long distance running and editing a film, because there's these ups and downs, and you feel great and you feel terrible, and it's not a sprint. It's a long, long road, and you have to be willing to stick with it. So every time I'm like filmmaking, I draw these parallels to running, because you're going to get there eventually, but it's going to be a long and hard path.
And just like in an ultra, it feels like it does never end.
And you want to say, fuck this. Why am I doing this?
Let's talk about your running a little bit. We haven't talked about running at all. This is supposed to be a
Yeah.
running podcast, whatever. Ooh, how do you approach running? Are you somebody who signs up for 5 races a year? Or do you somebody who just runs out the door and finds some trails? I mean, in many ways, your film showed that you love running as a sport, but you have such a challenging relationship with it
Hmm.
because of the expectations you put on yourself because of your mom. So when do you run? How do you run?
Um, it's very interesting, because my relationship with running has changed so much over the years, that I'm finally at a place where I feel like very, very comfortable and happy with where I'm at. And I have realized that I am definitely um, a much more uptight runner than I thought or wanted to be, in the sense that I actually like structure. Um, I would love to say that I'm very like spontaneous, and I'll just go out the door and see where the run takes me. But I actually realized that I hate that. I like to know how many miles I'm running. And if you're telling me we're going to run 2 more miles, I'm going to get annoyed, because my
Mhm.
head was already in 8 miles, not 10 miles.
Yep.
So that is something I discovered about myself, that I am more uptight than I thought. Um, but that, so yes, I would say that I really like having a race that gives me the schedule and the motivation. If I'm not training for a race, I love that time as well, because I can just run however long I want, however short I want, and I don't have to wake up early. And I really appreciate the times when I'm not training for a race. But I also really do like when I'm training for a race, because I feel um, like I talked about in my film, I feel very empowered with this sense of purpose. And I don't run races to place, to qualify, to any of that. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a very middle runner. So I really only run for myself. And I think that's why I have started loving running again after all those years when I was in high school. So I just run for myself. And so my main reason for training is just so I don't feel horrible in the race. And so I enjoy the race. And if I end up getting a good time and I feel good, that's amazing. But that is not my main goal, isn't always to like PR and all that. I just train to feel good about myself and to just kind of give myself confidence, I would say is my.
This is what makes our sport so great, I think, that we, especially trail running, where you can't even compare even the same race year over year. You can't compare if the weather is different or anything like that. So yeah, for you, a good race, as you say, is how much fun you had, how well you felt during the race, right?
Yes.
It's not about, oh, this was 10 minutes faster, or this was 20 minutes faster than half the runners or whatever, right? It's not the comparison with others. It's not even the comparison in time with yourself. It's about the experience. Did you enjoy
Yes.
yourself out there? Was it worth it spending the money
Yeah.
of race entry, right? Signing up for something. And that's what makes our sport so great. So what was one of your favorite races you've done? What is one of your fondest memories?
Oh man, I have so many. I
Well,
would
that's good to
say
hear.
it is
That's
good. I have some bad ones. I have some bad ones too.
exactly, because a lot of people have lots of bad ones, so it's great that
Yeah.
you have lots.
Yeah. And I would say that all of my good experiences or my all of my better experiences with races are all ultras or
Okay.
trail marathons and above. Anything below than that, I wouldn't say they're all bad, but I actually am realizing that that's all of my best races are on these longer distances. And I would say within the past year was my first 50 miler, which was last November 2022. I did, it's called Dead Horse Ultra in Moab, Utah, and it was a 50 miler. And because it was my first 50 miler, I trained a lot. I went out with my mom, with my sister, with my best friend, who's also an ultra runner, and we ran a lot of the race together. And I felt so good the whole race. Obviously, there was challenges, and obviously I felt tired, and obviously I was in pain. But overall, over the course of 11 and a bit hours, the whole race, I was in a really good mental space, which was really surprising for me. I was like, I'm running the longest I've ever run in my life. I'm on my feet for 11 hours. And when we started the race, it was 14 degrees outside. I'm from California, so
Yeah,
I was
it's
running with hand
impossible.
warmers. Yeah, it was insane. I was like, this is going to be a horrible race. I don't know how to run in the cold. And I and then we weren't allowed to have spectators on the course, so I couldn't see my mom and my sister until the finish line. And so I thought that was really going to suck, because seeing people on the course is really what helps. But I felt so good, and finished I finished before it got fully dark, so that was really exciting. And the runner's high, so I would say that that's recently one of my favorite races.
That's
And
amazing.
that's how I would say. I have no idea what place I got or anything. I liked my time, and but the best thing about it was that I just felt so good the whole race.
Yeah,
And I did not expect to feel that good for 50 miles.
yeah. That's fantastic. What do you have on the calendar for this year?
um for this year, I'm doing not a ton. I'm doing Headlands 50K, which is here in Marin County, a notoriously tough race, because the headlands, for people who are listening, know that the headlands in the Bay Area are just constant up and down, up and down, up and down. So it's very hilly race. But it's my first time doing a ultra in my hometown, so that's very exciting. Um,
You can sleep in
And
your own bed. That's always
yes,
great, right?
yeah, that's the best part. I can sleep in my own bed. I don't have to deal with the travel logistics. Um, and then after that, I have some small races, but really just trying to see if I can do another 50 miler at the end of the year. Um, I I don't know if what my ultimate distance would. I don't know if I want to run a 100 mile right now in my life. I don't want to, um, because just I have so many passions and so many things I like to do, and I love trail running, but it doesn't dictate my entire life in the sense that I don't have the time or desire to run 80 plus miles a week right now.
Mhm.
So I'm very happy in the 50K to 50 mile space. After maybe doing a few more 50 miles, maybe I'll have the guts to jump up to 100K. But I'm also not in my prime yet. For a female, your prime is 30 to 35, and I'm 29. So I still have time to get to my prime.
Well, there you go. So that means you have to run 100K for your 30th, right? I
Yeah, that's
mean,
a pretty good one. Yeah.
I love the 100K distance. I think it's a
Yeah.
big stretch. It's a round
Yeah.
number. For me as a German, it's anyway a better round number than
Mm-hmm.
the miles, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not as freakishly long as a 100
Long as
miler.
100. Yeah. Yeah.
I
My
like
head
it.
is still can't wrap my head around running for like 24 hours. I'm not there yet.
I yeah, I say that in almost every podcast. Running through the night is a really special experience,
Yes.
and it's fun and it's great to do. I have a hard time with the 24-hour plus, right? It's
Yeah.
like I can sort of wake up or have the day start again the next morning, but then when I'm looking at the clock and thinking I'm supposed to be doing another 12 hours after
Yeah.
that, that feels a little
It's
insane.
crazy. It is very, very crazy. When I was running out in Moab for my 50 miler, we started when it was still dark. We ran the first hour in the dark, and I would thought it was one of the most special things because, as you know, out in Utah, the red rocks, which weren't red at that time, but the background of the silhouette with the stars, my friend was like, this looks like we're in like a Star Wars planet. Like it's just at night or when the sun's not up, you just see everything in such a different way. And I think that's very unique. And especially in trail running, you're not in the city, you're out in the middle of nowhere where you can see so much more, which is amazing.
And that's what makes trail races so special, right? Because it
Yeah.
gives you that experience without you having to logistically figure all of this out yourself, right?
Yeah.
You sign up
You just do
for
it.
an adventure in a cool place, and somebody has the route marked for you, and you just follow it along, right? And
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's great. Let's talk final subject. Let's talk a little bit about your passion, women, and telling women's stories in filmmaking and women runners in filmmaking. I came to the film festival only this last fall, and my board told me very strongly about the importance of its mission in trying to tell diverse stories. And me as a white guy, I was nervous about that because I did not want to fault the mission. But I'm also at the mercy of the submissions of the filmmakers. I had no idea what I would get. And furthermore, I had no idea what I would do, especially given our sort of short and tight timeline. What would happen if we would get only submissions by white guys about white guys? What would I do, right? So I feel like, and I'm curious, and I don't want to lead you there, but I feel like our level of diversity was really great this year, and it was effortless. Like we didn't have to
Yeah.
fight very hard for it. Do you have the same impression? Did you walk away from this too, or were you like, yeah, it was all right, but we could have done better?
I think I think we had I think we had a really good a very good well-rounded amount of diversity. And the thing with diversity, which is really hard, is you'll always end up leaving someone or some group out. It's just so hard to 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 encompass so many people who identify in so many different ways. And so it's just very hard nowadays to figure out if what you're doing is enough. But with the Trail Running Film Festival specifically, I think we had a very good amount of submissions. And like you, I don't think we even had to even question ourselves that much when we were selecting the films. Do we have enough films that are diverse, whether they're women or people of color, LGBTQ? We happened to pick films that had all of this, which I think speaks a lot for the quality of films that are even getting made, that us as the judges didn't have to work so much to be like, okay, let's make sure we have a film about this person. Like we talked about it, but the amount of submissions that were already so varied, I think just says that there's already so many diverse stories out there being told.
Yeah, I was worried that if we focus on diversity, that it would turn it a little bit into a math equation,
Yes.
right? Where we're
exactly.
well, we need here this from there, and this from there, and this from there, and by the end, it would feel or would potentially feel too manufactured, right? Because the films still need to be inspiring. The films need to be still great films that tell great stories. And I think it worked out really well. For you as a filmmaker, does this, obviously it inspires you to make films, but does it give you hope? Where do you see sort of this trail running filmmaking? Give us a status report.
I think it does give me hope. I think that there is so much changing, and I'm trying to think of it both in the trail running space and the filmmaking space, because it's both. It's filmmakers in diversity, but also people on the trails and the outdoor space. And so it's really, how are we combining the two, including filmmakers who come from different backgrounds, but also athletes. So it's kind of a mix of both. And I think on both ends that there is some great progress. I can't speak for everyone, so I know there'll be people who definitely disagree with me, and there's still a lot of issues and inequality in many communities. I live in a predominantly white community in Northern California, so just by the nature of the community, there is many more white people and stuff like that, and so it's hard to know. Every community is different, really. But I would say as a whole, filmmaking and outdoors, there's a huge shift. And I work with a group called the Trail Mixed Collective that a friend started, and their mission is to have more inclusivity in all outdoor sports. So snowboarding, skiing, rock climbing, running, hiking for women of color. And I've done a couple films with them, and we have a few projects coming up, and I'm like realizing, wow, there's so much out there. It's just that, we want to share all those stories, and it's getting the time and the funding to share all of these diverse stories that are already existing out there. Just might not be known about.
I'm curious how this is going to evolve into next year, where when we open submissions again, because it is very clear that we've obviously generated a huge amount of buzz around what the film festival is and how sort of this new going back into theater tour can look like. So I have high hopes that filmmakers are going to be excited about submitting. But I've also heard that certain brands are definitively not interested in the film festival for their personal participation unless they have a film in it that is featuring one of their athletes. And I'm curious, where we're at when it comes to that, because if brands are going to submit films or want to sponsor with the caveat of having a film featured in some way, right? And if those films then only come featuring both from the filmmaker and from the person on screen to be white men, then we are going to be in the business decision, right? It's like, with how many brands do we want to partner? Because for this year, we didn't have the challenge at all, right? We selected films and we didn't really worry about any brand partnerships in that, right? And so I think that positions us very uniquely as a film festival, because we didn't push brand stories super, like contractually, if you will. But at the same time, I wonder where the brands are in that sense, right?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I think it's really hard with brands, especially when you're trying to get sponsorships and stuff, because brand stories that are like brand stories are they all have kind of, based on my experience, follow the same structure in their films, and they're all very, very similar. And so I think it's really hard to find that balance of, getting brand, like you said, like the business side and getting the support of brands. But then if you include all these brand films, they're all really similar. And I think that, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right, but I think it is really hard. I just think that my opinion with brands is it's really nice to have backing of big name brands. That's amazing. But I just think that from a storytelling point of view and as an independent filmmaker, I don't feel like a lot of their storytelling techniques are quite there yet, because they're trying to push a brand.
Yeah. This is an interesting. That is an interesting question, and you, especially as a filmmaker, you must think about this. It's like, if you are in the context of trail running, there is sort of an obvious way of telling a story. There is sort of a formula of, we're showing the hardship of the trail runner on the trail, and here's where we're showing the final success as they're crossing the finish line. And here we're showing the interview of the friend of the main protagonist, if you will, right? Who talks about how great that person, right? There is sort of a little bit of a formula in how our films have been made. And I'm curious if this is it, in the same way, every food television documentary sort of has the same formula, right? Yes. And sometimes that's just, because that's what works, right? I mean, that's what people like. Or do we have a different approach? Is there a different way, without like immediately blowing up the budget? Because it would be easy to say, well, if I just spend 10 times more, then I can use, these special effects, or these 15 more cameras, right? I mean, you can always do more with more, but can you tell a story that is incredibly engaging, that doesn't follow the same patterns that we've always seen, right? I mean, that's sort of like, hello, filmmakers, if you're listening to this podcast, that's what we're looking for the next submissions.
Well, I think it's really interesting, because I have a pretty strong opinion in terms of camera and that whole side of things, whereas because we live in a time where high-end cameras are much more affordable, people are focused so much on really nice shots, extreme slow motion, drones, the runner running up the rock slow-mo. And I think that's great, and that really adds to the story. But I think because of that, people are really forgetting what storytelling is about. And that was, the number one thing that I learned in film school, and when I was making my film, was my teacher was like, go and shoot with your iPhone for all I care about. I do not care what you shoot with. Bring me back a story that's really good. And I shot my film with a nice camera. I also used iPhone and I also used old video camera footage. So I used a whole mixed media thing. And I think, obviously for theaters, there's technical limitations and, 4K and all this, there are limitations that do exist. But from a storytelling point of view, I think a lot of young filmmakers are forgetting that you don't need the nicest camera to tell your story, and you don't need such a big budget. And winding back around to is there a different formula for storytelling? I would say yes. And that's been my whole dilemma of wanting to make a new film, is I purposely do not want to make a film about a successful ultra runner who's trying to do something, because I could go out and find a lot of ultra runners here who are trying to break this record or run Western States for the first time. There's a lot of that out there, but I don't want to do that. I want to tell something different. And that was the challenge with my film, which is why I think I ended up making it so personal, was it was following me doing a race, but there was so many more facets to it. And I think that does exist. But I think that a lot of times filmmakers and people get nice cameras and a really good runner finishing Western States as a good story. And that is very interesting, but that is not the only story. And I think us as a film festival, we do know that we have had many conversations, behind the scenes, saying we don't just want films of people running a race. So, for example, our film this year, Nettie from Ohio, she was finishing Western States, but she was so compelling as a character that even though it did follow a traditional story point of view, the reason why I thought that film was so compelling is that she was a middle-aged average runner, and that made her really interesting. So that's what I think people need to remember.
Well, and that's the interesting challenge, I think, in any kind of storytelling, and because so much in our sport runs around the storytelling around races, it's easy to follow the top runners because you beforehand know how they're going to be performing in many ways. So the shots that you need to get because the story that you want to tell. Right?
Yeah, but, and everyone knows who they are, so that's a huge plus too.
I mean, from a funding point of view, that's a huge plus too,
great,
right? But if you are in documentary, if it's easy to tell good stories PBS style on really old stuff because the history is sort of set in stone, right? And so you can go in and what story you want to tell. But in trail running, and especially follow a racer, well, you don't know how the race is going to unfold, right? And so to going in with sort of this preconceived notion, this is the story that I'm going to tell. And if it then doesn't turn out that way, did you capture the right shots? Did you capture the right moments, right? If things go sideways, are you still telling the right story, or right? And I think that's sort of the interesting challenge with this in the moment capturing, right?
And that's why I'm such a huge, fan and defender of editing, is that even if your story didn't come out the way you intended to when you shot it, there is still a story there. And that's why it's so interesting what you can do with post-production. And when I was prepping for my film and training for my first trail marathon, which was the subject of my film, my teacher said, he was like, I think it would be really interesting if you don't finish your race.
And you're fuck you, but sure.
Yeah, exactly. I was training and I was like, I'm trying to run my first trail marathon, but also direct a whole camera crew on the trail. So I was like, I'm taking on two roles, and you're telling me you don't want me to finish? We were already planning. There was, the slow motion shot of me finishing in the rain, which ended up spontaneously happening because it was pouring rain that day. It was great. But he was like, I think it'd be great if you don't finish your race, because that's a different story.
Art school teachers, man, they're ruthless.
He very cutthroat. I was like, oh, okay, well, thanks. But
that's hilarious. But I can totally see that he wanted to challenge you in telling and finding a way of crafting a story around not the typical happy ending narrative of like, here's how
Yeah.
much I struggled and overcome, and here's my happy smile at the end, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
obviously
exactly.
for you personally, it does help.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that helped me. I
Right?
thought my finished footage was great.
But also the feeling behind it. I mean,
Yes.
if it wouldn't have been and perhaps that's a little bit of a challenge in some of the other projects. If it wouldn't have been a finals for a school project and you wouldn't have finished, there's a chance that you would have been emotionally crushed, that you might have never
Hmm.
put the film together,
Yeah,
right? You might have not had the drive or the motivation to say, well, now I don't want to tell the story anymore, right? Now I'm
totally.
burying it. So
Yeah.
it is sort of a challenge, and perhaps that's a little bit the struggle, like how do you weave a narrative. I mean, that's where we're coming back to fiction again. We want a little bit of escapism, right? If you
Yeah.
tell stories of runners who struggle with injury all day long and never get their nutrition dialed and then DNF their races, I don't know how
Hmm.
compelling of a story
Right.
that would make. It's like, I don't want a mirror of my life. I
Yeah.
do want a little bit of inspiration and encouragement
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want it to all be horrible. But that's the thing about, I think, about making films about running and just documentary in general. The whole most documentaries that you'll watch that you think are really good is because they have a very compelling human element.
Mhm.
It's all documentaries all about the human experience, whether it's about a serial killer or about a famous athlete. They're all about this human element, and that's what makes
Interesting
documentary. Yeah,
comparison, but yeah.
interesting. Both a little bit crazy. I didn't even do that on purpose. But both kind of crazy. But it's all about the human element. So if people are so focused on filming their character running this race, but they forget to actually like really get to know their characters. And that was something that I had to do a lot in film school. They were like, you need to go spend a weekend with your character. You need to interview them, even if you're not going to have an interview featured in the film. You need to interview them. You really want to get to know your character, because that's what's going to drive the film. So if you as an audience have a reason to be watching this character, then you will be more interested in them
Mhm.
running said race.
Mhm. You need to find a way of being invested into that
Yes.
person's life, right?
Yeah.
And if you find the right connection to it, that's why we can enjoy documentaries not drawn to people that do stuff that is completely out of our wheelhouse, out of our
Yeah.
interests, right? Because we invest into that person's story, and then we can be inspired no matter what they do. I mean, they could
Yeah.
be weaving a rug for all we care, and all of
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
sudden it becomes compelling and fascinating to watch, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And that's what I like when I was making my film. We had to use all these films as references, and obviously at that time, one of the most famous films while I was making my film was Free Solo, and so I use that as a reference because I was like, the fact that this guy is doing what he's doing is already so interesting. It makes for amazing footage. But what I found even more interesting is when you hear about his background, and he goes to the doctors to do a brain scan to figure out why he does what he does and his growing up. And I was like, that's why the film was so good.
Mm-hmm.
He's obviously doing something insane, so that obviously sells itself. But then
Mm-hmm.
you actually know the character, and
Mm-hmm.
so that's really what made it even better.
Yeah.
So
No,
yeah.
absolutely. I agree. I like it. Now you ended up with the pinnacle of outdoor documentaries over the last year. So again,
Yeah.
can we finish off with that? Is that kind of caliber of film we are expecting for submissions for
A free solo.
free solo type trail running film submission for 2024? What are you
2024.
looking forward? What are you looking forward to for 2024? I mean, I know we're barely wrapping up
I know.
2023 and stuff, but since it's still hot and fresh, perhaps it's kind of good to think about 2024.
Well, for the festival, are you talking about the
Hmm.
festival
Yeah.
specifically? I'm really looking forward to, now that 2023 was so successful back in person, and we had such a huge, turnout of hosts and of audience and ticket sales and stuff. I am really looking forward to taking the festival to the next level, in the sense that our setup for the 2023 festival was very similar to the virtual setup, just because there was a lot of structural changes as a festival, and it was our first year doing this system and in person, and it worked. But I am really interested in taking it to the next level, doing something, the word, I wouldn't say more interesting, but I just different, because for the past couple, and especially me as the person who's been putting together the festival to screen, I have been following the same pattern for the past 3 years of the way I'm editing the festival. And I'm looking forward to doing something different, more unique, and taking it to the next level now that we realized that it worked last year. It's like, okay, now what can we do that's different, that makes people wanting to come back? Because people had a great year, and I already had lots of people reaching out to me after, but we don't want to make it the same as this year. I think we all want to make it better.
Yeah. No, I like this. When it comes to film submissions, I know this is such an unfair question, but I mean, is there a specific storyline or location, or what would sort of blow your socks off? Is there something that you could think of? I mean, you're thinking a lot about what kind of stories would you tell if you would get a film submission and you're like, whoa, that's going to take the cake. Is there something that you're looking for?
No, I wouldn't say specifically, but I would say anything that is, and again, this is very subjective, I would say anything that's something that I've never heard of or seen before is what I would think would be the most interesting, meaning whether it's a race or an adventure somewhere else in the world with somebody that I've never heard of before. I just think that would be a really fresh take. And again, this is very subjective because we all know different people.
That's why I'm asking you. You're not speaking on behalf of the film festival.
I'm speaking on behalf
of Nicole. Exactly.
Me, Nicole.
Yeah.
And a lot of the films we picked this year, which were really amazing, I already either knew the character or the race they were doing or the mission they were on. And most of them I was familiar with some part of the story. And I think it would be really interesting just to have something completely different, and maybe not American based would be very interesting. Even if we're at an American festival, a story that takes place outside of the US is really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see what kinds of films we can
I love it.
Bring up.
Yeah. I love it. Super exciting to have you have your eye on this and your heart in this. I think this is a super cool project. Thank you so much for coming on Singletrack. If people want to reach out to you, where's the best way to connect with you? Where should we send people to?
I would say the best way you can connect with me would be my Instagram, which is Nix, Nix, Amyx, Amyx 9. It's a very weird spelling. Or you can check out my website, NicoleAmyxFilm.com. But yeah, I always am looking to connect with filmmakers, runners. I still want to bring another film back to the festival at some point, hopefully maybe next year, the year after, make my next film. So I am always thinking about that.
I love it. Super. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matthias.